So I am up here to introduce our next two speakers. We have Lauren Morgenroth, who is the Chief Operating Officer and runs daily operations for Therapeutic Research and Neuromuscular Disorders Solutions, which is easier to say as TRiNDS. She also oversees the clinical operation solutions and team of project managers. Lauren's career in multi-center clinical trial operations spans more than 15 years. And joining Lauren in just a minute will be Ana Christensen. Ana Christensen is a patient science liaison at TRiNDS. Ana presents clients research and development programs around the country and helps clients learn how to engage with the communities they serve to improve the research experience for everyone. So come on up, ladies.
Thank you for the introductions, and thank you again for CureDuchenne for putting on this great conference. I think it's a great opportunity to be close to the community and close to the families and talk with all of the other sponsors so we can learn more from you, learn and help you understand some of the ins and outs. So what we were tasked to do with Ana during today's conference is to help you understand a little bit of what happens behind the scenes, what you're going through when it comes to clinical trials. For a lot of the success for our community, we need drugs to be approved, and in order for these drugs to be approved, we have to go through clinical trials. And so we wanted here to give you an opportunity to learn a little bit more about the process, ask questions. There'll be a good amount of portion here where we're want you to ask us questions. We'll, towards the end, do a little interactive session with Ana, so that's where she's going to come in and help me out, and there'll be some visual aids as well to help you through this. So we always tend to start with our disclosures, so I just wanted to, again, let you know, and Jen introduced us, both Ana and I work for TRiNDS. We are a contract research organization whose clients are companies as well as academic clinical trial sites. And CureDuchenne, as you heard from Deborah, is a partner in our ventures. We are also the coordinating center for an academic clinical trial called Synergy. And Synergy's been an academic clinical trial network for close to 20 years. It was started in 2000, still continues to be the largest and strongest neuromuscular network. And it's well known for some of the academic studies it has done, including the Duchenne natural history that followed patients for nearly 10 years. We've received grant funding through many government funds, NIH, Department of Defense, but many other parent foundations as well. And I've not received any financial support for this presentation, and Ana's travel was covered by NS. So when it really comes to clinical trials, many families really wonder, what is a clinical trial? Why are they so strict? Why do they take so long? I think many of us get frustrated by the process of how long it is. And then how do you actually make the right decision? Which trial is going to be right? So what we're going to be doing in today's session is kind of exploring these aspects of clinical trials. And please, because we're a small group, make sure you put your hands up, ask any questions. Happy to stop throughout the process of this presentation to review those. The take-home message, because we like to kind of just right from the start, take-home message here is that clinical trials are experiments to answer questions about a new drug and sometimes even devices. Clinical trials follow safety, ethical, and scientific rules. And it's very important to ask questions when you're thinking about a clinical trial. So let's kind of dive right into what is a clinical trial. And so I think we see that many families kind of imagine that there's a great idea, there's all this magic that's maybe happening, and then we get to that new treatment. But in reality, there's a whole process that happens behind the scenes and getting to that maybe phase 3 or the point in time when you can submit for filings with the regulatory agencies. So we first have the stage of preclinical. This is when maybe that idea is generated by the scientists, and we think about what can we do in the labs, in cell lines, to see what these different interventions can do. From that point, typically it moves to a phase 1. Phase 1 are trials that are in smaller groups, sometimes are shorter in period. This is when you're really seeing if it's safe in maybe a normal healthy control population. Depending on the intervention, sometimes it's actually also done in patients with the particular disorder. And so these are kind of short, you're testing safety. If that clears and there's no safety signals that are alarming, you can then move to a phase 2. A phase 2 is what we call the safety, and really kind of looking for any side effects and maybe some early signals of efficacy. So is the drug maybe working for kind of some early markers? Those studies tend to be smaller. They have probably less than 150 patients when you see these trials. The length of them can vary, but they tend to be kind of 12 months, 6 to 12 months, because you're really looking at what is the acute safety in that period for these patients. If that clears and you look good, that's typically when you move to what would be called a pivotal, phase 3. These are really to measure the effectiveness, is the drug working, and you're monitoring all the possible side effects that could be caused by the intervention. Those tend to be a little bit larger, a little bit longer, so these will have more patients. This is oftentimes when the design may have some placebo phase or comparator arms, and then the size is about 100 or plus. In rare disease, you can have them smaller. When you're looking at clinical trials for general indications, those are going to be your very large studies that have 2,000. In rare disease, obviously, they're closer to the 200. And then when you get to phase 4, these are oftentimes the post-marketing. These are when you're continuing to monitor safety in a long-term follow-up. So that's kind of what really happens in terms of the different stages, and it's important to know at what stage are you considering being in a trial for kind of the progress of these interventions through the course of the clinical trials. Questions at this point? Okay. Yeah.
Can you clarify that, our drugs, a lot of them are going through accelerated approval. Can
Mm-hmm.
you just clarify at what point things change and shift? I think that's going to be the case.
Right. And again, with rare disease, we really are trying to push for these accelerated approvals. And so that really happens throughout these phases that you see here. The companies are working with the regulators to get extra indications, rare disease indication, orphan drug designation. Those are different designations that can help them go through the process in a more focused, dedicated mechanism that can maybe help them accelerate some of these steps to be able to get early approvals based on early indications of these clinical trials. So this is typical, but we're trying to kind of push the needle faster, quicker, because of the need for the rare disease community. Thanks, Jen. Yep.
For any clinical trial, like FDA to approve the medicine, right, it has to follow all these phases. For example, if one drug is doing the super like phase 1 itself, so it can be approved immediately by the FDA. So my question is, like, it has to go through 4 phases every time, or if everything is fine, it can be approved by after phase 1 itself.
So it would be pretty rare to be approved. So do you want me to repeat the question? Yeah. So the question was, could you skip steps? So could you have a drug go under phase 1 and then get immediate approval? Is that the question? So I think that would be pretty uncommon, and Mike Kelly can also address this as well, that you really, phase 1 oftentimes are in the non-affected population. So these could be in healthy volunteers. And so you really want to be able to test it in the population that you want to seek approval for. And so it would be extremely uncommon and probably unprecedented, unheard of, and I don't even think that would be a good idea scientifically to not test it in the population that you are seeking approval for. So you would definitely need a phase 2, phase 2-3. Some of them are, again, to Jen's point, they're trying to kind of merge studies where you have a maybe phase 2 that leads to kind of 2-3 that kind of can accelerate that process. Right.
My question is, it has to follow all the phases mandatorily, or for example, after phase 2 something is doing good, or some drug is doing good after phase 3, so can FDA go and approve it?
So if there's the evidence that is supported, and in discussions with the regulators, they feel that the package may have enough material to be able to submit towards that new drug approval. So during this entire process, companies and academic centers that are seeking their approval of the drug are working hand in hand with the regulators, and they have periodic interactions, meetings for them to be able to review the materials that they've collected to date and be able to say, are we in a stage where we have enough supporting evidence for us to be able to submit to seek approval. So it is an iterative process throughout this entire kind of these different phases where they are interacting to make sure they have enough supporting evidence to help them submit for seeking approval.
Thank you.
So again, we want to remind everyone that a clinical trial is an experiment, and the experiment answers a question. And so we wanted to also be able to provide some explanation of some of these types of studies. And when you enter the clinical trial world, there's a whole new vocabulary that you're going to be learning. And so some key terms we wanted to review with you are study design. So that's very important to know, what kind of design am I considering to participate in? Is this something in a clinical trial? It tends to be more hypothesis-driven. You're answering a specific question, versus, say, a natural history study where you're actually trying to see what happens in the real world and natural history progression of the disease. Sample size is how many patients are needed. In clinical trials, those tend to be a little bit smaller because you have a narrow question. In natural history studies, they are oftentimes much larger because you're looking at a broad range to see how is the disease course in the entire population. Endpoints, again, for clinical trials, they're going to be at safety and efficacy. That's what you're looking for. Is it safe and does it work? Whereas in observational or natural history studies, you're again looking at the observation and just the better understanding of the disease. Length of study, as I've kind of presented in that previous slide, will vary in clinical trials, but oftentimes they tend to be shorter because you're trying to get to that drug approval, versus natural history studies where you may be in a study for a very long time because we want to see how the disease is changing over time with maybe new interventions, new studies. And then the overall goals, obviously, for a clinical trial, we want the drug to be approved and patients to be able to receive it commercially. And then versus observational styles or natural history studies, you're really gathering information. Both are very important because they support the continued understanding of what's happening in the disease. So we wanted to also go through some common activities that happen when you are participating in clinical trials. So there's a lot of paperwork, both on the families, but on the researchers. We'll go through and explain what happens during consent and assent. There will be a lot of tests to see if a particular intervention works. So blood tests, physical exams, x-rays. And there will be also tests to see if physical therapists that are very specific based on if that drug is working to see that efficacy. Questions? Okay. So why are the trials so strict? And I think many times we hear from families there's this narrow age range, and my son doesn't qualify because he's too young, too old, hasn't been on a certain drug, hasn't been on the certain drug long enough. And so really the reason why we have all these rules is because we need to create some good data. So it's very important to have a very narrow group of patients. We sometimes often obviously restrict scheduling. It has to be at the same time so we can keep reproducibility. We sometimes, in many trials, families can't be in the room and can't be watching what's happening in the physical assessments. And that's really because we don't want to have additional variability of encouragement. The encouragement of one family may be different than the encouragement of another family. So we have to kind of keep very narrow, strict criteria. We recommend and push to have the same physical therapist test for each visit so there isn't, again, another area of variability or criticism when it comes to those rules for collecting good data. There's rules to protect safety. So we want to make sure, again, that we are not increasing risks for safety, and there's rules to protect the rights. So that's where we have these informed consents that are stamped and signed by these independent committees called institutional review boards. We want to make sure it is safe and it hasn't put additional harm to families and patients. So another big question we're asked by families is, why does it take so long? So again, thinking back to that chart, and you see all these phases, and why does it take so long? Well, there's a lot of things that go into actually having a clinical trial. So we want to make sure that there's an approved protocol. So that's kind of the step one when you're thinking about you have your idea and you create a protocol. I like to think of it as your recipe. So if you want to make and bake a pie, you need to have a detailed recipe so that you can reproduce that same pie. And so that protocol is outlining step by step everything that needs to be done. With rare disease, we are doing studies at multiple centers, so everybody has to have that same set of instructions, that same recipe, so that at the end you have the same deliverable. So we need to have this protocol that goes through, as you can imagine, multiple reviews. It has to be signed off by multiple different parties because we need to make sure we all agree to those same exact steps. We then have to select the centers, so which centers are going to participate, and where do we have more patients that maybe follow families that have a certain criteria? Are these centers trained and experts in running clinical trials? Do they have the adequate staff to be able to start a new study? And so these are all the things that are happening when that idea comes. You write the protocol, they have to pick the centers. You then need to get all the different approvals. That's when you have to get those stamps from the regulatory institutions at your centers to make sure it is safe, that it's been reviewed by an independent committee, that it's sure that you have put in the proper checks and balances for protecting the safety of the patients. We then start recruitment. So oftentimes recruitment starts with word of mouth, social media postings, attending different workshop events throughout the country to be able to learn more about clinical trials. Sometimes you can learn about clinical trials or you get information from different registries you may be set up in, or talking to your clinicians. And so that's really where the push for recruitment and participation. And we'll go through again with Ana, we'll explain a little bit more about what truly happens in that participation. Then you have to enter all the data. So the data has to be collected in, again, very uniform fashion where every center is collecting in the same way. We have to properly monitor that data to make sure there aren't any errors when it comes to entering the data or collecting the data. So many sponsors send individuals, third parties, to check that everything's being done in a very compliant, controlled fashion. And then once you have this collective volume of all this data, all the analysis starts. They start answering the questions they set out on that protocol. So from the start, they have that question. Then they have to perform all the different analyses to answer that question. There'll be presentations at different meetings, posters generated like the ones that you'll see later in the day, where it shows you some of the information and data from their studies. And then obviously the goal for all clinical trials is to get to that filing and drug approval. So are there questions on all these kind of steps? It can be very overwhelming, but we wanted to make sure we walked you through of kind of what happens behind the scenes and why sometimes does this take so long because of these additional steps that are needed. Okay. So now we'll move into the meat of how do you actually make the right choice. I think we're in a time where there are now multiple choices for trials, and so it can become very overwhelming on which trial is right and how do I know it's the right trial. So the process towards making the decision is the informed consent. So the goal is for you to be able to ask questions. It is a conversation. So you need to make sure that you go through that document and you understand what is involved in the research. So in all components of an informed consent, you have to be presented with the alternative. So what happens if I don't participate? What are the possible benefits? There may not be a direct benefit to my family, but is there a benefit to the community? Do you need to make sure there's always an opportunity for question, not just at that appointment when you decide to participate, but throughout. That is kind of your guide to your participation. It's going to have your schedule. It's going to have everything in there, who to call if you have a problem. So that's really kind of the document you want to keep with you all the time. It describes your risks and really the nature of the treatment. What am I doing? What is the purpose of this participation? Questions on this? And so you'll ask questions about maybe the science and the medical care. So these are, again, some sample questions for you to think about. And in your bags, we provided you with a kind of flyer. It's a front and back that has a little bit of these questions that are for you to take home to think about if you're going to participate in research of some of the things you may want to ask depending on these categories of medical and science and all these different things. So this has more extensive questions than what we're highlighting here in today's presentation. So you want to maybe understand why the study is being done. So are you in an early phase? Or are you in a later phase? how does the actual study intervention work? Is this something that you get in an IV? Is it something that you do by taking a pill? Is it something you take by drinking some sort of solution? Is it a shot? And so these are the types of things you really want to understand what the intervention is. And then what are the risks? So has this been, tested in smaller groups of patients? In those other patients, what were some of the risks? What were some of the side effects? How is this different than my regular care? Can I maintain my regular care? What does that look like? So these are all important questions that you'll want to think about in terms of the science and medical care. For study procedures, what are the tests like? Can I see videos of what they may look like? So you may go onto websites to be able to see, how can I learn exactly what that procedure looks like? What kind of support is there for my son with some of these tests? Are they going to be scary and painful? Is there somebody from child life support that can help with undergoing some of these tests? What are the risks of the actual tests? So there's the risks of the intervention, but there could be risks of the test. What are those, and how do I make sure that this is something I'm comfortable with? And what do I know if I'm really in the study? There's some studies that have comparator arms. Once you sign the consent form, you're in the study, but at what stage am I in the study? Am I actually receiving the intervention, and I'm not receiving the intervention? And then what happens after the study? When that's over, will I have an opportunity to participate in an extension study? Will I have the opportunity to continue to receive that intervention? What happens? And making sure that you ask those questions. Are there questions about the study procedures? In terms of the logistics in real life, that's really kind of the key here. You want to make sure this is going to work with your everyday life. So what kind of support is available to the families? Can I fit this with my work schedule? How do I actually get to the study visits? Is there travel support? Is there not travel support? Are the visits on weekdays? How is this going to work with the entire schedule? Is it covered by my insurance? Are there aspects covered? Are there aspects not covered? And again, thinking about siblings, the other family members, family obligations, are there times where you not be able to fit that schedule that you've been given in informed consent? And then how do you work around vacations, holidays? Some of our interventions and clinical trials have weekly visits. How does that fit in? Being proactive to see how we can fit that into the schedule. Any questions? Because we're right about at the point where we're going to invite Anna to come up. We're going to be handing out some visual aids for our little role play that we're going to start to help you kind of see what happens when you think about clinical trials. Okay, so we've decided to have this fun interactive session here where we do a little bit of role play. So Ana, who works with me at TRiNDS and is our patient science liaison, is going to help me in this role play. And so we have two scenarios that we are going to work you through on how to ask about trials. So the first clinical trial that I learned about, so I should say I'm the patient, and Anna's going to be our health team representatives throughout these two different scenarios. So I met with my doctor, my clinician, Dr. Graham, and during my appointment, they told me a little bit about this Choc Trial. So this is a randomized, double-blind, controlled trial to measure patient acceptance of layered chocolate candies in women aged 25 to 45. So the intervention here is Hershey Kisses or Hershey Nuggets once a day by mouth. And so it's non-random, in this case, you're all getting it, but so it's not really randomized for you to kind of join in. And so the primary outcome is a video-recorded acceptance test. And so the schedule for this study is a 12-study visit in a 6-month period that's occurring in Seattle. The visits include a timed walk test, weight, height, blood sugar test, a hair sample, a saliva sample, and pharmacokinetics, and travel support is available. So this is the flyer I see in the waiting room when I go to see my doctor, and obviously I have tons of questions because I'm just not sure. So we're going to switch now into the role play, and we're going to be interacting with the study doctor. So I met with Dr. Graham. I'm in the clinic, and Dr. Graham tells me about this from the flyer that's sitting in his office. And Dr. Graham says, go ahead and go talk to the study coordinator for the principal investigator. So the principal investigator is going to be the study doctor in charge of the study and say, go ahead and go talk to Dr. Wonka's study coordinator. So I get Dr. Wonka's study coordinator phone number and I call. So I'm calling.
Wonka Research Lab, this is Ana. How can I help you?
Hi, I just met with my doctor and he told me a little bit about the Choc Trial and I'm just not sure what it's for. Can you tell me why I should consider participating in the Choc Trial?
Sure. So the Choc Trial is really intended to see whether or not a layered chocolate product might be more potent for people who are normally receiving daily chocolate therapy. And so we are looking to see whether or not people who take the layered chocolates have a higher acceptance of the treatment compared to people who take daily Kisses treatment alone.
So what really is the benefit for me to be in this study?
So for this study, we're recruiting people who are already on daily chocolate Kisses treatment. And so whether or not you receive the new treatment, you will still receive an active product. And so our goal is to really see whether or not this new treatment would be better than what you have. So you would be receiving active treatment, so there's the possibility it could benefit you directly.
So does it matter how I currently take my Kisses?
For this study, it's important that you're on a daily dose and that you have a steady state for, it looks like 2 months prior to day 1, which is 40 days after the screening visit.
So I'm a little worried with this trial because that's a lot of study visits in 6 months. And for me, it's about a 3-hour drive to come to Seattle. How can I do this?
Well, you bring up a good point, and we do provide travel assistance. And let me just look up what our system is in my study notebook. Looks like for this trial, you would pay for it yourself and keep receipts and then submit them for reimbursement. And so that would be something to consider.
So that's going to be a pretty big burden for me. Is there any additional support I could get?
Well, we do, while the visits are in Seattle, you are allowed to switch at month 3 to a site in your home state. So you could talk to our Research Clinic Family Resource Center and see if they can get you set up at Ronald McDonald House or something equivalent, but there is a waiting list for that. So, it's important to think about whether or not you could actually attend the visits.
And I also saw there's kind of a lot of tests being done. So is that something that would take all day, or do I have to take off work?
Well, so the total amount of time for the visit is about 2 or 3 hours, but it's important to know the saliva sample test has to happen across the street at the university. And so, you have to get in your car and repark. So, it's good to plan to be here all day.
And what's pharmacokinetics?
So pharmacokinetics is a blood test that we do that tells you how your body processes the chocolate. And so we would place an IV and draw samples and then measure the amount of chocolate byproduct in your blood.
So do you think I should participate?
Well, this part's really up to you, and I would suggest that you talk to Dr. Graham and see what concerns he might have about this new layered chocolate treatment compared with your daily Kisses, and see if this would be an appropriate part of your experience.
Okay, so we'll just stop and see if the audience has additional questions they want to ask Dr. Wonka's study coordinator based on these types of setup here.
Bonus points if you've asked the question to a real DMD clinical trial. Really?
Okay. So now we're going to go to a common setting. So the patient kind of hangs up. Thank you so much for talking to me.
Have a great day.
And I have a bunch of other questions. I didn't ask all of them. I go online to try to learn a little bit more. And when I go online, I actually found another clinical trial. And now I see this second clinical trial. Now it's the BP250 trial. It's a multiple dose escalation study of chocolate-coated peanut butter candies in men and women. The intervention here is an open label peanut butter cup for 10 days with possible future open label extension protocol. The primary outcome measure is safety, and in this case, the schedule is 5 study visits in 1 month. It's happening in Denver. The visits include a saliva sample, fasting blood sugar, weight, body composition, colonoscopy, and quality of life surveys. Selected patients complete inpatient pharmacokinetics and travel is available. So now I've just kind of talked to Dr. Wonka's study coordinator. I go online and I find this other trial and I'm like, okay, now what do I do? Because now I see that there's other study. And so I see on this website the phone number for that study, and it's Dr. Kit Kat's team. And so now I call Dr. Kit Kat. So I dial up and I say,
National Chocolate Research Center, this is Ana. How can I help you?
Hi, Ana. I'm really overwhelmed and confused. I just met with my doctor earlier this week, and he told me about a clinical study he's doing at his center, the Choc Trial. But now I went online to learn more about Choc, and I got distracted and found this BP250. Mm-hmm. Are you associated with the Choc, or what is this different trial, and which one's better than the other, and how do I pick?
That's a great question. We've been getting a lot of calls because the Choc trial is a very large randomized trial, and the BP250 trial is a much smaller, earlier stage trial, really looking at peanut butter cups as a possible alternate to the standard Kisses treatment. And so really the purpose is different. So as you might have heard, the Choc trial is trying to learn whether or not the new treatment is better than the one we have now. And this study is really about learning if it's a safe treatment. So we're not trying to say anything about whether or not it works. We're trying to learn whether or not it's safe enough for future clinical trials.
So which
Does that
one's
help?
But which one's better?
Well, they're really different. So as you may have learned from the Choc trial, it's a longer-term trial. There's a possibility of open label access afterwards. This study is much earlier phase, so we're really just focused on learning is it safe enough to use in future studies. So it's a pretty intense study. You need to stay within 50 miles of Denver for the first 10 days. We have some invasive testing, and it's because it's really focused around safety, and because we don't know whether or not this treatment is safe enough to use in future trials.
So has this peanut butter cup been tried before?
It's been tried in the mouse model of daily Kisses treatment, and so far it was well tolerated by mice. They did have reduced time on the treadmill, on their mouse wheels, but we're not sure if that's really significant for people or not.
So are there risks with the peanut butter cup?
Well, there's always the risk that you won't tolerate the treatment itself. So for this treatment, there's a possible risk of peanut allergy. There's a possible risk of development of insulin resistance and diabetes. But a lot of these we don't know because we've only tested it in mice.
And this visit schedule, like you said, is a lot more. So does that mean I have to essentially quit my job for being there for that month?
So you're required to stay within 50 miles of Denver for the first 10 days of treatment. And you have several visits during that 10-day period. So if you lived locally, you could stay at home. But because you live in Pittsburgh, you would need to travel to Colorado and move into the Ronald McDonald House. So unless your work can allow you to telecommute, you would need to take time off.
So are there other people I could talk to about kind of how they were able to coordinate some of all these kind of life changes and being able to readjust?
Sure. We have a special group available on the Chocolate Exchange website, which is a novel social media platform being launched by our patient advocacy group.
So do I go back and talk to my doctor about this? Do I go back and talk to Dr. Wonka? Like, how do I decide what to do next?
So I would really suggest you talk to Dr. Graham and talk to him about these two studies, because he may not have mentioned our study because it wasn't a good match for where you are clinically, or it could be just that he wasn't aware. But he knows your clinical care best, so he'll be able to give you some advice. But if you decide that you want to give this study a try, the first step would be for you to fly to Denver, complete some informed consent forms, and then we would request your medical records and review them for 10 days prior to allowing you to continue.
Do families want to ask additional questions to Dr. Kit Kat's study coordinator?
Yes. So that's a great question. You need to be somebody, So this study also requires that you're on a stable dose of kisses. You need to be willing to come within 50 miles of Denver. There is also a colonoscopy for this test, so you need to be medically cleared to be able to have the colonoscopy in order to participate in the study at all. For this study, you need to have a BMI of less than 40. And so that's part of why we would do that body composition test at screening.
So we're hearing some great questions. Again, that's another critical piece is the eligibility. And so really at the end of the day, and thank you, Ana, for this, it's really how do you choose? So here we've just kind of summarized some of these key ideas and concepts of how would the visit schedule work? So you may want to kind of think about the pros and cons of these different opportunities that you may come across of what does the schedule look like, which one has covered travel, which one has a place to stay. So in the one case, we gave you an example where there was opportunity to stay in a Ronald McDonald house. In that case, though, you have to stay close to the hospital center. So because it's in an earlier phase, you have to stay closer because of safety. So there's really always kind of a reason for why there are these criteria in these studies, whether they are because you're early phase of tasting safety or, again, kind of some of the logistics. What about some of the money? So in the one case, you had to keep your receipts and submit for reimbursement. That may be a huge burden for some families to be able to pay up front for some of these costs, especially if it's purchasing a flight or having to get hotels, versus the other one that's going to, in this case, in this example, send you a credit card. And so you have to kind of think about these things of, again, going back to the examples we gave you on the impact of the logistics and the family. Which one am I kind of most interested in? I wonder if the nugget would be better treatment for me than the kisses that I'm already on, or do I want to test something new that would be added onto my kisses? And so there's some studies where you're testing something completely new versus testing an alternative. And so, again, asking questions about that long-term access to that intervention. In the case of the Choc trial, there is long-term access. You would get it on after. In the case of the other one, maybe. They're still not sure because it's an early phase and sometimes they can't really commit at that stage. So you really need to understand kind of some of these criteria. And then again, the impact of my care. Am I changing what I'm already on? So many trials in Duchenne have to have children that are on prednisone. And so is it prednisone, is it deflazacort? Can it be either one? Is there a particular regimen? What happens if I want to change that dose? And so these are the types of questions we really want you to think about. And again, looking at the flyer to help you kind of when you're considering participating in research.
So you feel free to use that flyer when you go to your clinic visits. You can use it like a literal checklist. I'm a visual person and I always freeze up when I go to the doctor. So feel free to ask that stuff. And I think the other point is that if you have a question or something that would be a limitation for you, it never hurts anything to ask. So to say, would there be a possibility of home visits? Would there be, in a study where you're supposed to keep receipts, is there a way the sponsor can book it for you directly? All those kinds of things. You know, the answer might be no, but at least you will have asked for what you need.
And so we wanted to make sure that you remember that, again, a clinical trial is an experiment. We don't know if it will work or not, and that's really why we're doing them. The clinical trials do follow these safety, ethical, and scientific rules, so they are put in place to protect patients. And again, it's very important to ask questions, not just at the beginning, but throughout. If things are changing, making sure you are talking to the study team and letting them know if you're seeing anything that's changing or if you have additional questions. Life situations change, you may move. If you move, how does that impact the trial participation? Other things could be happening that you need to make sure you are keeping close in contact with that study team. And then at the end, it is your choice and you can always change your mind. And that's always a component of that informed consent. Again, things change, you can change your mind, but it's important to talk to the doctor that's running the study before you make those changes because there could be safety implications. Anybody who's been in studies want to share their story or share any questions they may have? Jen has the mic. We can go around and kind of where I think we've caught up on the schedule, so we have definitely some time for discussion, and this was set up to have a fair amount of discussion.
So while people are thinking of their clinical trial horror stories, Does everybody know what a principal investigator is and what a coordinator is? Okay, so principal investigator is the doctor who's in charge of the study site. So it might be your DMD doctor, but it might be somebody else. And they're in charge to make sure their whole team is following the protocol and they're supervising the patients. They're great for questions about what does this drug do? How does it work? Would it be medically appropriate for my kid? So that's what they do. Study coordinator is a little like a project manager for research. They are the ones that are going to schedule your visits. You'll probably see them at all of your clinic appointments. They will probably be the one to answer the phone when you do your phone screening, and they're great for things like logistics, how it really works in practice. So it's like you say it has a cardiac MRI, how long does that take? What's required to get an MRI? They're the ones who are going to know all of that stuff. And so when you're thinking about industry-sponsored clinical trials or academic trials, there will always be those two roles. And the study coordinator might also be a nurse. So they might also be someone who can say, oh, from my nursing perspective, here's what I think. But it might be someone who isn't, and they're just focused on the logistics.
Any other questions for either self or Ana? And we are part of the expert team too, so if you have any questions about being in clinical trials or just the logistics of going through a clinical trial, you can sign up on the board. I think that's by the registration for more either one-on-one asking us questions about some of these logistics and some of the terminology. Like I said, it becomes very overwhelming and you learn an entirely new vocabulary of kind of, as Ana said, the principal investigator, study coordinator, FDA, IND, NDA, and it just can be very overwhelming, and we're happy to talk more with you for any of your specific questions.
Is there any one place that you can find out about the existing clinical trials on the website, individual pharmaceutical companies' websites?
So your trick goes like this. You go to clinicaltrials.gov, G-O-V, and any study in the US that involves people is required to be listed there. And there's a search box, and you can put in whatever you want. So if you're someone with asthma, you can type in asthma, or you can type DMD, and it'll show you all of the open trials. And it'll have the listing for every single center in that trial and whether or not they're enrolling. So, but you will hear about studies that aren't on there yet, and it's because they might be in that preclinical stage, they might not have opened a study yet, they might have finished a study and it's totally closed, but that's a great way to see what's coming really soon. But the other way is to stay in contact with CureDuchenne, because they have a lot of resources, they are really have their fingers on the pulse of what's happening and are a great resource for you too. But clinicaltrials.gov is a thing you can do from your pajamas in the middle of the night if you're anxious about it. So.
And there's also some resources put on. MDA, I believe, has the clinical trial sorter.
There's a bunch of different clinical trial finder tools through the different nonprofits, and they're also really good. So you just feel free to use whichever you prefer, whatever learning style you have.
The clinical trial finder helps you kind of narrow down some criteria. So it will ask you, I think, a series of like 4 questions. It's run by a software program called Anecdote, I think something like that, where it says like kind of what's your indication. So you put it in Duchenne, how old is your son? You could say 12. Is he, this basic criteria, is he ambulatory, non-ambulatory? You plug that in. Is he already taking steroids or not? And then it will kind of narrow down what the choices are based on those criteria. The same thing with many of the registries that families may be enrolled on. They run those same type of narrowing searches to then send you letters on what you qualify based on what you entered into the registry. So I think it's also another plug that if you are signed up for a registry, that's goal is to help you identify patients for studies, that the information you put in is what they're using to create and generate those letters that you may receive either by email or in the mail. So it's important that what you're putting in is your current state and then talking to your doctor.
Yeah, I think the one most powerful thing you can do is to tell your local DMD doctor that you're interested in research. And you tell them every visit, every single time. Because I think both Lauren and I have known sites who have opened studies for one family. Sometimes that's all that it takes. So, if you go out there and do only one thing every single visit, you say, I want to do research. What do you have for me? Or do you know of anything? And keep it on the top of their mind. Because otherwise they might, when they get approached to do a clinical trial, they might not know that they have someone who's really excited about research. They might think their patients aren't into it.
And I think we've done some focus groups around the country of asking families that have participated in research, families that have not, as well as the healthcare centers. And I think for the healthcare team, what's challenging is that patients are coming in for a medical care appointment. And so the time is limited, and oftentimes there's a lot of questions about just the general care. Is there changes to the steroid dose? Do we have to meet with the DME experts to check for different supportive devices? And so again, they may not have the entire time to talk about research, but I think if you say I'm interested in research, do you have a study coordinator, or do you have another team member that I could call to have more time to talk about the different research opportunities, or can you send me to some websites that may help me with where my son is at in terms of their disease course?
So one question I have, right? So if I want to participate in a clinical trial, but so if I want to participate in a clinical trial, but this Duchenne has like a variety of deletion, mutations, or duplication, or so. For example, right, there are like some of the cases, right. If I want to interested, but you have to qualify for the company, the pharmaceutical company really researching on it. So most of the time, what happens is. So I'm one of the guys. So we were initially, my son diagnosed with DMD. So he had a deletion mutation. So with a nonsense mutation, we don't have proper idea what is the nonsense mutation, what is the deletion mutation, what is this duplicate mutation. So we were waiting, hoping for PTC, but finally it came through trials. But we came to know my son has a deletion with the nonsense mutation, but is not qualified.
Yeah.
So it is very hard. Like what I'm trying to bring up here is, we have to have an idea before we are approaching a guy. We have to do our own study more to whether I qualify for research or not. That is, I think, as a parent part, they have to do more. So.
Yeah, it's
so
really
instead of
difficult.
like waiting, and after like it breaks your heart, right? So all of a sudden you hear from me that okay, you are not eligible for it, so it breaks your heart. So that's what I'm saying. Whenever the trials coming up, we have to really look for what they are looking for it, and whether I'm qualified or not, you have to learn ahead of the time and putting more hopes on it. So that's my comment on it.
No, and I think it's a great comment. I think it goes back to the eligibility, making sure you understand up front what the eligibility is so that you don't have false hope or just disappointment when maybe you've already gone to an appointment and you start to screen and you realize you may not even have the right mutation, or too old, or there's certain criteria, 'cause there's some that have very narrow criteria on performance of certain tests that I think it's important to ask, what can I do ahead to see if I would be likely to be qualified or not, just because of the ups and downs of waiting to find out if you're going to be eligible.
So I agree completely, and you did a great plug because Mike Kelly is going to do a review of all of the research happening in DMD, which now includes a lot of approaches that are not specific to genotype. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that your best asset for understanding that stuff is your genetic counselor at your clinic. Or you could have your local DMD doctor call one of the principal investigators and learn more about what's really required, because that stuff's complicated, and sometimes it involves a site calling the company and saying, okay, we have a weird thing we weren't expecting, would it be helped by this product? And that happens all the time, and it's totally normal, and it doesn't mean your local doctor is bad, it just means this stuff's complicated. So those are your two big things that you can have in your pocket. And you can ask your doctor, say, hey, would you be willing to call the doctor in charge over in LA or over wherever and learn more about whether or not I could do that study in the future?
And I think that's a great point. We see that a lot, that your primary care doctor, your primary doctor will call the person leading the study. I think that's very important to get them also knowledgeable about the study so that they can help you make that informed decision.
Or they could call Mike Kelly or whoever, that's what a lot of our roles are, is to help people understand a lot of this really confusing, weird stuff.
So we'll take one question
Yeah.
on the left, and then there's one on the right
Cool.
after.
I had a question about, so if your child is in a clinical trial, and let's say it goes through like the first phase of it or whatever, how can we get, so if they had, blood work or MRIs or things like that, can we get that information?
Depends on the study. So some studies, yes. A lot of studies, no. And there's a couple reasons for that. One is the companies that do the lab tests for studies are not certified necessarily for clinical care. And their normal ranges are often really different. And so sometimes it makes it really hard to compare the two. Some studies will have a certain point in the trial where then you can receive everything. Some will say you can get it at the end of the study, which might be 2 years after you're done. It really depends. So it's an important thing to always ask and say, my preference is this, can we do that? And ask up front.
And it should be in uniform consent. So there's always a section that's required to say, will I get the test results? And so that's where kind of what Anna's describing is some tests you may, some tests you may not. But make sure you are asking which ones can I get results for, which ones can't. It often has to do sometimes with who's actually performing the test.
Yeah.
Is it a clinical center? Is it a research center? And is the study blinded? Oftentimes that's where you have to wait until a certain period of time has passed in order to get those results to make sure everything stays controlled.
Yeah, but that's a great question and something that you should always ask if that's important to you. Oh, she's coming.
So in the clinical trials, the one thing that I've found that seems to be lacking is the educating the child. I mean, I think they take for granted that they're just asking him to go through these little games and things, and that like he doesn't understand what's happening. And when we tried out for a clinical trial, we were told that he'd get 2 chances to do the walk and do all of these things. And we went through the first part. And then we found out that no, he wasn't going to get a second chance, that he was like 40 meters shy of the walk. But the clinical team, like PT supervisor was there. She saw him do the walk, thought that was the best he could do, didn't think that it was worth giving him a second chance. So they come back and explain that to us, but they didn't explain everything to him. They didn't tell him, oh, so-and-so's here, so this is going to be your big opportunity, whatever. I mean, I know they don't want us there motivating them and providing, but I think that for every clinical trial, the child needs to be made aware of every step, what the process is, and what they're looking for, and treat him like he understands. Because my son was really upset, thinking, well, they told me I had 2 chances. This wasn't my best. I would have done my best if I thought I wasn't going to get another. I was just kind of like feeling through the course kind of thing. And so it really upset him not having that second opportunity and being told that he was out of the trial.
Yeah.
So I just think that that's a piece that's lacking,
Yeah.
and that social, emotional support afterwards too, for the child. And I think that's
Yeah.
something every clinical trial should include.
Yeah, and I think it's a great point and something that we've heard from the community in doing these pilot focus groups. We have seen some companies and some academic centers start developing more child-friendly materials. So there's the group in Newcastle University in the UK with the partnership of TRiNDS, which is a great organization that has a lot of patient material and patient education that has been piloting and has even used for several of their studies that they've kind of helped them, an app that kind of explains with the child's voice the different procedures, showing videos of kind of what these things look like so that the child can see kind of what is a walk test, and they can kind of watch other kids do it so they understand. I think it's important when you're thinking about a clinical trial if that study team has child life services included, because that is where some of that could be helped. I think hearing from you in these platforms, and all sponsors listen and think about making sure you offer these services in your trials so that it's very clear. There's been a lot of initiatives with having the companies all come together to develop common materials that can be used in all trials of a welcome to you're joining a clinical trial. These are all the different things that are happening during the clinical trial. So I think these are great feedback.
And so the two things to think about for your next trial, clearly that situation sounds not fun at all. And I'm really sorry on behalf of whoever it was that had that experience. It's always okay to ask about rescreening. So rescreening is where you may do your first visit and then you fail, which is a giant bummer, and they make you wait a certain amount of time and then you can try again. So sometimes that's allowed, sometimes that's not. It's also okay to ask the site, if you have a kid who's really concrete and is someone who really loves routine, and that's his nature, it is okay to ask to be able to see the space where it's done, see an example, because what happens is that when the kid shows up for the clinical trial, sometimes the coaching that they get is really scripted, and they're not allowed to do what they would do in the PT gym. In a PT gym, you can offer them chocolate, you can offer them a toy, you can do all these different things, and in clinical trials, sometimes you can't. The actual words are scripted, like we're super limited. So I think it's an okay thing for families to ask for, to say, can I see a video of it? Can I see a picture? Can I go to the hallway where it's done and learn what might be allowed? Because that'll be really different study to study. But yeah, it's always incredibly frustrating and sad for everybody whenever somebody doesn't qualify. There's usually, on the study team side, everyone goes home and kind of cries a little bit over coffee. It's not fun for anybody.
So Anna and I are here through the end of the Futures meeting, so feel free to come ask us any additional questions. And then it's kind of a perfect segue for Mike Kelly to actually give you the specifics of what's happening now that we've given you some introduction of the questions to ask and the different types of studies that you may be approached to participate in or come across on the internet. So thanks.